Welcome to Cyber Synapse, the podcast that's creating connections through cyberspace, with candid conversations about cyber and tech-related issues, with your host, Knibbs. Do you know your GDPR from your ISO? Is your business cyber secure? If not, give agency a call on 03455 760 999. You can visit their website at www.theagency.com. An agency is with an I, not a Y. Hi, welcome to this week's episode. This week I'm joined by Dr. Holly Powell-Jones, and we discuss her recent doctoral research where she conducted a study asking children, well, adolescents mainly, about why they might or might not report things online, what were considered legal, illegal, and, you know, a really, really good in-depth discussion on where young people sit with their confusion about the law, about online behaviour. And we kind of digressed a little bit into the difficulties of really understanding this for young people, because the law isn't always quite clear. So I'm just thinking the best thing to do is probably just let you listen to the interview rather than me rambling on, and just to say that I have a couple of episodes coming up, and then I'm going to take a short break, probably later on in the summer time, you know, as I did last year, to give myself just a little bit of rest and recuperation, because I've got a lot on at the moment, and of course I want some time for self-care, and then going forward it won't be long before we're into kind of September, October, and that will be heading towards season 3, which is quite outstanding for something that I thought I might not can get going for a long time. I've got people actually asking to be on the podcast, and I just wanted to say thank you for those who take the time to message me, to email. I really, really do appreciate the feedback, and yes, I'm going to get to those kinds of studies and subjects soon. Obviously, getting some of the people that I need to speak to, or getting to some of the people that I need to speak to and having these kinds of conversations isn't quite as easy as 1, 2, 3, because obviously because of the kind of subjects that they are. Hopefully there's going to be a lot more going forward in terms of diversity again on topics. I might be having some people back from season 1, season 2, just to have a discussion about where things are now, 18 months, 2 years down the line, in terms of progress in cyberspace. Yeah, until next time, have a great week. I hope you're enjoying this episode, and thank you for listening, watching. Take care. Welcome to Cyber Synapse. This week I'm joined by Dr. Holly Powell-Jones, and the reason that I'm kind of, well, I begged, borrowed and pleaded to get you on this podcast, actually, so I'm just going to fess up there. You have recently finished your PhD in sociology at the City University, isn't it, down in London? And your PhD was around. In fact, would you like to introduce yourself in terms of your research? But what we're going to be looking at today is something that's cropped up in the last 2 episodes regarding why adults don't report things online or what's happened online. And actually, that's kind of what you looked at, but with adolescents.
That's right, yeah. So I'll give you the elevator pitch for my research. So I used to teach I still do teach social media law and ethics in secondary schools. And I think the legal framework is something that's really absent from a lot of digital literacy and projects in schools. We don't start with the basics, which is what is a criminal offence online, what is serious versus kind of less serious. And through that, I got a police funding grant, and I worked with a local media company. We reached thousands, literally thousands of young people. So I was going to schools very regularly, talking to young people about what they thought was or wasn't a crime online. And someone said to me, oh, that'd make a really interesting research project. So that's kind of what I did. I got a scholarship to go to City University and work in their sociology department. But my research basically investigates perceptions of risk online with 11 to 18-year-olds, bearing in mind that I am talking about risks in a very subjective, socially constructed, and I'm looking at what young people do or don't think is a risk online, but also what beliefs are underpinning those viewpoints. So I asked them to say, how risky is it and why, and basically wrote down everything they said and analysed the results.
Yeah. Okay. So the geek in me goes, we might come on to how we actually analyse all of this stuff, because language is key. Language, I mean, I think I've started
Absolutely.
That. Language matters, language is key. So for those people who have been listening for a while, I absolutely adore talking about how adolescents work, what their brain does, how they make sense of the world. So should we start with, do you want to go through what your findings were? Because I know that you've got a fantastic 2-minute video. It's not even 2 minutes, actually. Talk about being able to be succinct. And what you talked about was the effects that you found and kind of what young people were saying, and the kind of material that they looked at risks on, that you defined risks under.
Yeah, so I gave out some stimulus material, which was basically some mocked up examples of different posts, online posts, and they were meant to represent things that could be criminally offensive. So things like indecent images. Obviously I couldn't give indecent images to young people, so it was a link with a message that was mocked up to suggest an indecent video. Malicious or threatening, harassing communications, hate speech, allegations of child abuse, and a few other things as well. And these were based on, so the Crown Prosecution Service has got guidelines on prosecuting social media offences. So that's kind of what was informing that. And my main findings really, I mean, my number one finding is complete lack of consensus of what is or isn't a criminal risk online. And for me, the disturbing thing was that the sharing of indecent images of someone that could be underage as well was the one that had the most debate and disagreement, which is strange because that is the one area of social media law that I think has been done to death in schools. So it's strange to me to see that that is the one that is still having a lot of debate and uncertainty around how legal that is. Few other interesting findings, depressing findings, is that the victim blaming, victim responsibility rhetoric is still very, very strong amongst young people. So, a victim, a target, shouldn't have done X if they didn't want to be attacked. But also even after an incident had occurred, people saying, well, the victim should just choose not to be offended by that, or they should just brush it off, or sometimes even, the victim wouldn't care, they wouldn't notice, they wouldn't see. So real denial of victim legitimacy in online spaces, online contexts, right down to the classic old, it's just words, it's not doing anything.
Have you seen, because I've just had one of those fizzbuzz moments, Professor Alice Roberts has gone off Twitter for those exact reasons?
One of very many people now. And I actually think one of the examples I gave out was a celebrity a tweet about Beyonce. And that was because other studies have shown this as well, that this idea of celebrity is quite interesting because people are famous or because they're rich or because they've chosen to put themselves in the public sphere. There is this idea that they cannot be a victim, or that they cannot be victimized, or that words won't hurt them. And that's, of course, just not true. We know that, lots of people who are very famous and very public do get a lot of abuse. They are a bigger target, and it does affect them really negatively. And I think with social media as well, we are allowing young people to become micro celebrities very, very quickly. So part of that thinking is that, well, they've got loads of followers, they put themselves out where they're not going to be affected by online abuse. I mean, that is a really worrying thing.
Well, God, I have got so many questions to ask you. I'm just going to have to slow myself down a touch, right? Because I think what we can do is we can have a look at, let's have a look at online abuse, what that is, and because we've had the online harms white paper, which I haven't actually gone into a podcast discussion with anybody about just yet, but we might do some of that here. But I'm just thinking, so we've got the social media platform that allows misandry, misogyny, victim blaming. We've also got the idea of Facebook famous. So that was the phrase that young people would use. So many years ago, 8-9 years ago, I was actually going into schools doing PHSE, and I'd be saying, okay, this is what happens to your brain when you get drunk and so on and so forth. And I actually used to give an example and say to the young people, so if you did this, would you do that for that amount of money? And kind of they'd all go, no, I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, what about if I gave you 100 quid and made your Facebook famous? Oh, yeah. So actually buying into celebrity is something that's sought after. And I think young people say, I want to be a YouTuber. Well, it's changed now. The narrative is now Twitcher. I want to be a Twitcher and earn the money. So there is this thing about what are we doing as a society to create this narrative that's kind of producing children who want to be YouTubers, Twitchers, Facebook famous, and then have this kind of attitude that, you know, if you are famous, well, you're free game. Anybody can have a go at you.
And I think that's absolutely the right question to be asking. I mean, you know, you say you're talking about very micro level, what's going on in your brain at certain points. I'm very macro level as well, in that I'm like, well, what's going on in the culture and the society and the politics around these young people as they're growing up, and how does that affect kind of how they perceive what is and isn't acceptable behaviour, and what is and isn't, you know, deviant versus normal, and all these kinds of things. And the reality is, I think it's very hypocritical of some of the people who are in power at the moment trying to sort of crack down on online hate speech, abusive comments, and kind of incivility and stuff online, when actually we have a lot of that in our public sphere, in our media, in our politics. And, you know, let's just state the blooming obvious. The President of the United States of America is the person who young people say to me, well, you're telling me I shouldn't say this and I can't say this, and that this is a risk and that that's going to damage my reputation. But he's managed to become one of the leaders of one of the largest countries in the world. So is that even true? And that's a really valid point, you know. I think it's very hypocritical of adults to make this a problem with children and young people, when actually we have a problem in our society with all of these things.
I think sometimes when I am teaching and I hear this narrative coming out from the adults, and I kind of do that thing where I lean forward and go, who parents them? Who actually parented these children that are now doing this behaviour? Where did this stem from? They didn't just suddenly become abusive, children. There's learned behaviours, there's socialised behaviours, etc., etc.
And I think the media as well. I mean, I'm a lecturer in media law and ethics for journalism students and PR students and media students. And there is some research and some evidence that a lot of the behaviour online and on social media is mimicking what happens in the mainstream media and in the press. And so there's a bit of a thing going on there with actually what happens in our press and our mainstream media does influence some of the online behaviours as well.
Absolutely. I think when I see, so there was a tweet that I've ended up being slightly sarcastic about today. When I actually see kind of teachers or adults saying, the children are being cyberbullied and they're doing this and they're doing that. Actually, if you look at some of these people who are online, they also do the same things. But they will justify it in the way that will say, well, actually, I'm arguing a point, Kath. Well, are you arguing a point? Or does that come under the classification of trolling? Or does it come under flaming? Or does it come under cyberbullying? Or does it come under online harms? You know, and there's another problem. Too many categories, too many labels for things without saying this is what this is. And I actually found that...
I personally don't. I mean, I can see that it's needed in certain situations, and unfortunately it's very common now, so we kind of are stuck with it. But even the term cyberbullying, I am a little bit uncomfortable at times with that huge broad brushstroke definition, because are we talking about hate speech? Are we talking about stalking and harassment? Are we talking about doxing? Are we talking about, defamation or privacy breaches? Like, there's so many things, behaviors within that I do think it's interesting to look at terminology. And in the 4 chapters, findings chapters of my thesis, the first chapter was all about meaning making and labeling terminology and how young people interpreted meaning, whether they thought it was ambiguous or not, and what labels they put to it. The second chapter was looking at the relationships between a perpetrator and a target as well, and how that affected whether or not it was seen as acceptable to post. The third one was looking at justifications and the ways in which an individual sender and their rights were seen to potentially trump a target. And lastly, I looked at whether they thought there were any potential consequences for the behavior, and often it was the case of no consequences, even if they thought the behavior itself wasn't acceptable. When it drilled down to, well, what would happen to someone if they posted this, often it was, well, probably nothing.
Yes, what I picked up, I think it was on your press release when you put that out. Actually, I was supposed to have that on in the background, but I got sidelined with getting this sorted this morning. One of the things that you'd said was that children didn't even understand, for most of the time, that you actually can get in trouble for illegal activity online, because there's this thing about, but it's online, it's not real life. And that distinction between not understanding that virtual is the same as real,
Yeah, and I think, again, we've got to look at the context within these discussions as well. So there is a lot of inconsistency into how the law is applied in practice. We know this. And I think, on the one hand, I get very frustrated when people talk about a Wild West of an online environment that doesn't have any rules, that doesn't have any laws. And we have plenty of laws, and this is why I teach social media law. We have plenty of laws that are applied to online behaviour, and I use a whole host of real life case studies of people that have been prosecuted for online content or conduct under these laws. So firstly, you don't know that the police aren't going to do anything, because quite often they do. But on the other hand, it is very inconsistent. And at the same time, we hear many stories, particularly with so-called revenge porn, image-based abuse and sharing of sexual imagery, that the police have said, quite recently there was a report saying that they haven't had any training since the law came in 2015. And so victims are still being told we can't do anything about it. So on the one hand, there's a crackdown on online speech. Then on the other hand, there is quite often victims being left told that they can't do anything. So no wonder children are confused.
Yeah, well, that kind of ties into my work as a therapist. Is quite often the resulting impact of sexting, and how we've had so many names for it over the last 5-6 years that sometimes I don't actually know what I'm now supposed to call it, because it was and I think I've actually said this before on the podcast. I was talking to one young lady a couple of years ago, and I'd said, yes, but that's classed as an indecent image. And she said, actually, Kath, it was well decent. And I went, and that's the problem with language. Yeah. It's a classic moment. But I do find with the underage sharing of explicit images, because that's what I'm now calling it, is CEOP brought out their rules and said, well, actually, what you need to do is look at it this way, that way, and the other way. And it's being interpreted subjectively by different local authorities, police forces, schools. And then what I do find is that the narrative that tends to come into the room is all men are misogynists. It's all down to the boys being aggressive, coercive, etc., etc., and the girls are the victims. And yet, when I get into the nitty gritty of sitting with the clients and so on, actually, there's victims on both sides. There's victims, where images have then been shared without consent, but we don't have the same kind of laws that apply to what's called revenge porn, because that's only 18 plus. So, we're in this.
I feel like there's three things to mention here. The first one is what I'm hearing a lot now, and what I agree with, is we have to be careful of using laws that were designed to protect children to criminalise and cause further harm to children. So we really have to test whether it is in the public interest to prosecute for that sort of behaviour. And the second thing I want to say is, look, girls are growing up in a hyper, and boys, and gender neutral people increasingly, because gender is fluid, as we know, are growing up in a hypersexualized culture whereby role models who we look up to, rich, famous, successful, powerful women, tend to self-objectify a lot. You can't walk down the street without seeing a scantily clad, but ultimately successful, powerful women image in front of you. So it is almost, natural when you think about it, that younger girls will want to emulate that. And the third thing I wanted to say is, it's a good point here to mention the Law Commission. So the Law Commission undertook a kind of scoping review of online and abusive behaviours, and they published a report with some information on that in November 2018. It's on their website. They are now looking into reviewing things like hate speech and indecent image sharing online as well. And I think that will really help, because one of the things that they found from their scoping report was that terms like obscene, indecent, malicious, grossly offensive were so subjective and vague as to almost be unhelpful.
Well, my slant on some of this has been, so recently I had the latest COP Think You Know update, blah, 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 and this is what you need to tell children. Sexting is wrong. And I went, well, that's a bit of a moral compass, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe we say it's illegal and we give them the law, but we can't say if it's right or wrong, because that's about...
yeah, and the reason why I love doing what I do in terms of my online media law work in schools is that I get to go in and say, look, don't shoot the messenger. I didn't invent these laws. I'm here to communicate that they exist to you and show you how they're applied. But what I love is that the idea that I'm creating a whole generation of critical legal scholars and critical criminologists, because they turn around to me and say, hang on, so what, I can have sex if I'm 16, but I can't send a sexy picture until I'm 18. Hang on, so I can be held criminally responsible from the age of 10, but I'm not responsible enough to own a pet until I'm 13 under the law.
Yeah.
Like, what is going on? And I love having those conversations. And to be honest, I don't understand why we don't have public legal education in schools already. Human rights, crime and law should be a basic part of PSHE already, and the social media digital law aspect is just one part of that, really. And I often get asked about sex and crime more in my sessions than I do about digital communications.
Yes, pornography is the question, and it relates to pornography, and so I can have sex but I can't watch pornography. I can share an image when I'm 18. So all of those same kind of arguments, and that's literally what I sit with. And I'm going to say some of them are about 10 or 11, because the age at which pornography is being accessed is 8. So I am working with lots and lots of young children. And there is a whole heap of conversations that absolutely mimic and reflect what you've just said there. And I go, I know, it doesn't make sense to me, so I'm not sure how I'm supposed to explain it to you, but this is what it is.
And one of the things I noticed actually from my research, and I did mention it because one of the posts was an allegation of an abusive sexual relationship between an adult and a child, a teacher and a student. And that was almost the most interesting one for me, because young people were so aware of sexual offending, of grooming, of paedophilia, of rape. And those discussions, I think, are really, really important to have. And sometimes they brought up sexual violence without me having even thought of it in connection to a post that I'd created. But it's very clear to me that young people are comfortable and even confident to have these conversations, and they want to have these conversations. But I fear that it's adults who are uncomfortable about leaning into those conversations and wanting to shut it down in order to protect children, when actually I think the best way to protect children is to lean into those conversations, uncomfortable as they are, because children want to and need to talk about things like this.
Yes. So and many people know this on the podcast, I talk about, I have always had very, very frank conversations with my children. to the point of being accused of being a liberal parent, because I'm like, but the thing is if you have these conversations, then there's no shame about a conversation to be had. I probably embarrassed the heck out of my kids when I was doing the kind of sex education, so on, because I'd talk to them way before they were, having sex. We had conversations about body parts, about people, about consent, and which I'll probably come back to that one. But the conversations that I have most with my clients are that nobody's talking to them like this. So and I do find that's what happened when I was teaching the sex education, was the materials that I was asked to share with the children, were inappropriate because they were generally victim blaming, or terribly horrific, which is the thing that I ended up debating on Victoria Derbyshire against the NSPCC. These resources do not need to be shown to children. A conversation needs to be had.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the way that children learn, is when you say, okay, so this is what the law is. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think asking questions, I mean, I teach at universities as well as in secondary schools, and I think asking questions is the best way to teach, actually, is to have a reflective conversation.
Yes.
And if young people say something that you think, oh gosh, that doesn't sound right, rather than saying you're completely wrong, ask a question. Say, that's an interesting point. Why do you think that? Or what about this? Or how come this happened? Or what if, say, this scenario, and just get them to kind of do the work themselves through thinking through and talking through. Because I can absolutely say, from my perspective, I'm not from a social sciences background. My undergrad degree was in theatre. My postgrad degree was in radio journalism, and I've ended up in criminology and sociology and law at PhD level. And the way that I learnt about sociology was through talking, listening, and discussion-based learning. So I think that's really, really important to encourage more of, and especially around difficult subject matter, because if us adults can't have a proper, sensible conversation that's respectful about sensitive subject matter, how can we expect young people to?
Well, for me, this is the issue around the discussions around pornography. It doesn't even happen within my profession. In terms of psychosexual therapists will talk about pornography. Your average everyday therapist is like, not for me, thank you. So what does happen, and I've kind of developed this course with another therapist, is that we need to be talking to children about it. I'll come on to why I think that's so urgent in just a second, but we need to be talking to our children in the therapy room and saying, every topic is on the table here, particularly the one industry you are likely to come across. And let's just go with the news of today, that actually, and this pornography age verification thing is still nowhere in sight. So the likelihood is this is continuing. Children are coming across it, and they will see it, and they will share it, and they will watch it. And why are we not having these discussions in the therapy room?
One of the best things that I saw in the theatre for a long time, I used to go to the theatre a lot, was a show called Why Is the Sky Blue by Abbey Wright, Tackroom Theatre. Why is the Sky Blue? And it was based on, I think, around 10,000 interviews with young people about pornography. And it turned into a musical, what's known as a verbatim musical. So much like with my research, it's verbatim quotes from people. And it was the most amazing, profound, prolific, funny, poignant show that I've seen for a long time. And it shows how you think you're having a conversation about pornography, but it goes into conversations about love, about respect, about bodies, about sexuality, and all these other things that come from a seemingly sort of dark place, actually is a conversation about what it means to be human and how we relate to each other. And I can't believe that show isn't everywhere all the time, all around. So well, I've just jotted it down, and if I can find a link, I'll put that in the show notes as well. Theatre people who have budgets for this kind of thing, please go and look at Why Is the Sky Blue. It's amazing, and it's from the mouths of children. And just like with my research, what we're trying to do here is make sure that young people's voices and perspectives and opinions are not lost in the debate about policies that are going to affect them. Absolutely. For me, there's something about the best thinkers on the planet are the adolescents. Because of what's going on in terms of how they think, they're not limited and constrained by the boxes, are they? No, and they're still in that stage of learning to challenge authority, and that's a really so it's tricky, but it's also a really wonderfully productive space to have conversations.
Yeah, I've just realised this was the point I was going to make about pornography. So the question I get asked in therapy is, so how come, Kath? And this will go back to that indecent images, underage images, kind of sticky wicket that the children are finding themselves around, is when we say that you have to be 18 to watch pornography, and that people in pornography need to be 18 plus to actually take part, how come some of them dress as though they're 14, 15, 16? And then why do we then have the difficulties of young people going, but I don't know how to tell the age? And, you know, so I'm just thinking there is a campaign from Marie Collins, actually, it's on Lad Bible, about if you don't know whether somebody's 18 or not, just don't watch it. And I'm like, but how do the kids know this? If they go to, let's go with the most famous free site, they're right at the very top, barely legal. Well, how do they know if somebody is legal or not legal on that very cusp when some of the people dress in the pornography videos as though they are younger anyway?
And this links right back to, I think it was a year or two ago, Plan UK was looking at girls' rights, and they were talking, they did a report about street harassment and the number of girls that have been sexually harassed in public in their school uniform as well. This is connected, you know?
Yeah. And what a difficulty for young people. In terms of trying to understand where the law fits in kind of like pornography, sexual relationships, sexuality, what they're doing online, and then the law.
Yeah, there's a case that I want to talk about, and I have to watch myself legally with this one to get it right. But there was a case of a businessman, a well-known businessman, who met an underage girl through a sugar daddy website. And was cleared of all charges in relation to sex with that girl, which people can find that case very easily online and read about it if they want to. But I think that case, for me, flags up all the moral, ethical, legal issues with how we think about things like power, responsibility, consent, age, etc. Online. And I, again, rather than telling girls don't go on a sugar daddy website or don't, we're increasingly now we're talking about university students being engaged in webcamming and other forms of sex work, rather than saying to girls don't do it. The broader question has to be, well, why are people doing it? What's driving people to use those sites? I mean, for girls, it obviously is, there is a financial, amongst many other things, a financial and a love and attention pull factor for them. And I think we need to have another conversation that's linked, which is what is driving men, older men, to use these sites as well, and have a look at it in a sort of holistic way, and if possible in a non-judgmental way, because I'm not one of these kind of Puritan paternalistic types who says let's shut it all down, it's all terrible. I just think again, it's actually the black and white kind of simplified thinking about it that is harming debate, and we're not, like I say, we're not talking to the very people that are within these environments that we need to be talking to really get a handle on what's going on and making sure that people are safe. I mean, I want to protect children just as much as the next person, but I don't think we can do that by excluding people who know what they're talking about from the conversations.
Yeah, I have noticed that quite a lot of the research that, and I'm going to go blames pornography and so on, because there's quite a lot of it out there. I was thinking when we first started, I don't know if you've listened to John Ronson's conversation Last Days of August.
I haven't, but I've heard so many great things about it. It's on my list.
It's a very good podcast in terms of how he just puts the kind of, let's call it, evidence out there for you to think about. He's done it in a fabulous way that makes people critically think as well. But there is something about the online abuse that this lady was subjected to, and I'm going to go in quotes, just because she was a porn star, and that made it a justification for kind of attacking her. there is something about the narrative of when we blame porn for the reason why children do. Well, actually, there's a lot more going on, and I'm fully aware, because of the research that I do, what is happening within the porn industry and kind of how it does twist and change the narrative.
I mean, the criminologist in me says this goes right back to constructs of ideal victims and ideal offenders. Niels Christie did a paper in the 80s on this, who gets legitimate victim status and who doesn't. And we are still very tied up in a lot of stereotypes about victims and perpetrators that we need to kind of free ourselves from, I think, in terms of when we talk about a lot of these things. But yeah, and victimology, which is almost like a sub part of criminology, has been really, really interesting for me, because my research is very much placing young people almost like a social audience of behaviours. So I'm giving them the examples, and they are like the witnesses, the bystanders, the public, the press, whatever you like, looking at this behaviour and making a judgment on it. And I love being a sociologist, because whatever we're talking about, the question always comes back to, you know, Howard Becker's, whose side are we on here? We have to keep critical about who gets to decide and define what is acceptable in our society. And it is always tied up with power. And that's what we have to think about as sociologists, and I think as people in the media as well. Whose side are we on? Whose voices are we amplifying, and whose are we overlooking?
Well, yes, this goes back to that kind of parenting, what I kind of mentioned before we came on here about the holier than now parents who are on social media giving it, we understand digital parenting, we understand. Well, quite often I go, okay, n equals 1. How many children have you actually got? And for me, there's something about we can't know everything. It's why I dislike the word expert when people say, oh, Kath's an expert. And I go, no, I'm not. I'm a specialist, but I'm not an expert, because actually I don't know everything. And I've only got my frame of reference to the world. It's my experience, and I don't want to talk like a academic and go phenomenology, but it's my experience of the world, and I've kind of been shaped by my experiences and my kind of like my access to stuff, because there's probably things I don't know.
I think as well, like with my research, and I've written about it in more detail in my thesis, is we have social contexts within which we learn about what isn't okay in the world. And, you know, in the old medieval days, you would have had probably quite a specific social context. Your village, you know, would have been, they would have set the very clear kind of rules for engagement of social life. But now, because of the online world and everything being more mobile, we've got access to lots of different social contexts with lots of different social norms, and the boundaries between them are blurring, integrating, and there's leakage, if you like, of ideas. And on the one hand, that's very exciting, but I also think that is leading to almost a bit of a, dare I say it, like normlessness, whereby, particularly in online environments, anything goes. We know on the dark web that you can go, or in various chat rooms, you can go to places and have conversations that people like me would think are absolutely outrageous, but yet have them normalized in certain groups. And you know, we're kind of getting to the online grooming, radicalization sort of discussions now as well. But that is the point. We need to keep coming back to, can we find universal moral values in this day and age? And I think that's when it's really useful to come back to universal human rights. And if we can go back to that framework, we might one day be able to have some kind of regulatory governing system that works on a global scale.
Yeah, what's good for the humans. So I have a phrase where I say humanity plus, or and I've taken it from somebody else, so it's not mine at all. I've totally plagiarized. But there you are. I'm gonna own that. Is it for the good of humanity, or is it not? And when I do have that framework, actually, where am I coming from? Because I was just thinking, the thing that I constantly say, both to clients when I'm teaching, I think I've said it on nearly all the podcasts that I've done in some way, shape or form, that there's something called the Dunbar effect, and that's 150 people in a hunter-gatherer tribe. That's kind of what we can max out on in terms of relationships and kind of conversations. And yet if you take the people who have access to the internet and kind of apply that to who could access my child, we're talking about a village that consists of 4.8 billion people. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, I mean, that just blows my head in terms of, and how would I come up with what's normal? Yeah. Because for me, there's something about what was once secret and in my head, there's now a place on the internet to go and have that conversation.
Yeah, and I do think we have to be clear that there are positive sides to that as well. So a lot of young people now are feeling more open about having conversations publicly about things like mental health, about sexuality, and all these things that would have once been seen as sort of taboo to talk about in public. And I think there's some really positive things about some of that. But it is that process between being a child and being an adult, and it is a process of becoming that it can be I think tricky if everything is up and out there online, and and adults are some of the worst, I think, for posting all their innermost darkest thoughts and feelings sort of a bit haphazardly online. And we talked earlier about how actually it's many adults who are very, very quick on social media to post a comment that they might later regret. It's not specifically a child thing. But we're all in processes of becoming, and with the public permanent nature of online platforms, how is that going to work in the future? Are we going to get better at erasing our content, and are we going to become more self-censoring? Are we going to actually just have a shift of social norms and become more forgiving? I don't know.
Well, I must admit, I don't know whether to call it a job, but part of my teaching counsellors is there's ethics that we have to adhere to in the real world. And then we also need to remember that when we're online, those ethics still need to apply. So, for example, I was watching a conversation the other day that said something about, what do you think about clients who bring mobile phones into the room? Now, I've got a whole kind of a tutorial session where I talk about the ethics, the cybersecurity, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, this thread delineated into, well, I think it's a total load of bollocks, children. And I was like, oh, what is going on here? I think that what you should do is ban the phones out of the room. And literally, these therapists were arguing with each other online to the point that I actually kind of interjected and said, I'm really concerned that we talk like this to each other. And actually, you haven't, and it's the phrase I'm constantly using, you have no guarantees that there aren't clients in this group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that started me doing this training in the first place was back in 2013 when we elected police and crime commissioners. And down in Kent, they elected a youth police, well, they nominated and hired a youth police and crime commissioner, Paris Brown, who at the age of 17 was very publicly shamed, to quote John Watson's book, kind of publicly ruined through by the press on the basis of some tweets that she'd sent. And I've always said, I'm not justifying her comments. I agree that some of those comments were completely inappropriate for someone who's going to be in charge of the police. But also with my media law and ethics hat on, is that the equivalent of trawling through somebody's bins, going through their old Twitter accounts to try and dredge up material? Is it valid public interest? I'm not sure. And I think me as a human being with just my own compassionate head on, I would not have done that to someone who was 17 and still under the UN rules, still a child. And I also think, what kind of message are we sending to young people? We're saying, don't you dare put your head up above the parapet. Don't you dare put yourself forward for a public role and responsibility, because we will find something about that you are ashamed of and we will tear you down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's that's what I see in politics all the time. And I think what did spring in then was that recently happened to Kevin Hart, didn't it, regarding the Oscars? So, and I actually watched it. I was really curious, actually, how he handled it. I thought was really great, because he said, I've already apologised for this in the past. I did it when I was X number of years of age. I can't remember how old he was when he made these. They were slightly misogynistic comments, I believe. He'd then apologised for it, and yet again, it got dredged up saying, "Oh, do you remember that time you were, misogynistic?" And he said, "I'm a totally different person now."
And again, To me, again, it comes back to, well, who has certain power and privileges and who doesn't? This isn't applied equally. We have seen candidates in this country put themselves forward to be prime minister, and then having to go and say, oh, actually, yeah, I did take some cocaine back in the day. Oh, whoops, sorry, let's all move on. We're allowed to make a mistake. And I was like, well, you're allowed to make a mistake because you have certain privileges that come with who you are and where you are in society. And there are plenty of people who would not, their political careers would not have survived something like that. So while we're being moral and making judgments about what is and isn't okay, the question has always got to be, well, who is it being applied to? And are we doing something consistently and fairly here? Because I don't think we are.
Well, I mean, theoretically, 17-year-olds are still children, as are 24, 25 and 26-year-olds. You know, if you look at brain science, what we do know is that people don't think, in fact, I think I
know a few people in that.
There was
who might still be in that zone.
One of my clients this week said, well, my thinking was a little bit flawed there. And I said, do you think that's to do with your brain development? And the client went, yeah, because you've taught me about that. But yeah, I was thinking that, you know, it wouldn't happen. And I said,
I also, even regardless of the brain development stuff, I don't want us to live in a society where people are afraid of making mistakes all the time to the point that they cannot grow and develop and put themselves out there. I mean, there's some terrifying research that's coming out showing the extent to which young people have fear of failure and fear of being judged, and as you mentioned already, shame. You know, it is such a powerful social tool, and I think there are some people who need some relief from that fear of shame and embarrassment. And I think there are some people out there who are completely shameless. You know, the President of the United States, some of our politicians who won't apologise for things that they ought to and won't take back comments that they've made are shameless. So there's some people who could do with a bit more shame and some people could do with a bit less, perhaps.
For me, it's, I kind of go around intimacy, empathy and compassion. They're what I think, that's what would make us the humanity plus kind of, like you were saying earlier, then we would have the universal laws and the universal truths and the universal empaths, and wouldn't we just be a nice society?
I live in hope.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do too. And I think sometimes that's kind of how I sit as a therapist, is just going, you know, really, does this really matter? You know, I flunked my GCSEs, or I didn't get the A-level results I wanted, or I said this to my girlfriend and now she's really unhappy with me. And that, really, in the grand scale of things, is this the biggest thing it could ever be? Or do we kind of go, yeah, do you know, sometimes I make mistakes. I often... not kind of self-disclosure, but I often tell my clients how I fail. So I actually put a post up the other day where I jumped into a conversation with my son and I went into mother mode. I went into fixer-er, and before you know it, we'd followed the same old patterns. I'd put the phone down and then I went, I know this stuff. You know, it was a classic moment where I sat for maybe an hour going, how do I sort this out? Well, I know that when there's a rupture, you make a repair and you know, and I've got to be the one that does that because I am the person who has transitioned through adolescence. Whereas my children are still in their 20s. So they're not fully developed in terms of being able to, just a lot of things, actually. I was just going to say impulse control. They're not able to manage their emotions as well because there's something about, because that's what it's like to be a young person.
And I think part of growing into adulthood is recognising that adults aren't these people that have got everything sorted, that know what they're doing, and recognising people as adults as being flawed human beings. And you know, that's quite sad, but it's also quite empowering, I think, for young people. And to me, that is what the process of becoming an adult, you know, involves. And looking critically at the world around you. And thank goodness we've got some amazing young people coming up through the ranks now. I am so inspired by some of the things that young people are doing to improve society, improve politics, make positive positive changes in the world around them. I have to say, you know, nowhere in my research is there any evidence of a lack of empathy amongst young people. You know, there is empathy there, and they are making some real strides in fixing a lot of the things that previous generations have completely kind of mucked up, really, and that gives me endless hope.
Okay, well, because we're on like about 46 minutes, something like that. Did you want to kind of quickly go through the findings?
Love to.
I think that's really, really important for people to kind of get a grasp of.
That's great. Yeah. So running down, I've actually got a list in front of me, which
okay, good. Maybe we should have done that.
So I've mentioned the fact there's not very much consensus, a lot of diversity in terms of what is seen as risky online and how risky. You know, sharing of indecent images was something that had the most disagreement, even though we should have had the most education on it. Interestingly, the younger students tended to use the higher risk categories a lot more, and the older teenagers, the sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, geared towards the lower risk categories. My sort of theory around this is that they've just spent more time online, and they will have seen sort of perhaps this type of speech a lot more. They'd have been exposed to it. They might have seen it being sort of tolerated, and therefore have the idea that it isn't as risky. Whereas the younger students, bless them, are a bit more like, oh, you know, that's awful. That's got to be a crime. That's terrible. I think lots of questions about blame and responsibility in relation to risk. Quite often, a lot of responsibility was placed on the target for online kind of abusive messages, that the victim should have behaved differently either before, during or after an incident in order to manage that risk to themselves. I think as well, you know, this idea of in the theory, I talked a lot about the social construction of risk and the sociology of risk, and I think what keeps coming out again and again is this idea of an ideal citizen is one that can sort of manage all the risks themselves, that they can just sort of skillfully know about risks, manage risky behavior, minimize risks, deal with it, and not have to rely on any kind of external support, state support, parental support, or any kind of interventions from anyone else. And it was interesting, of the 4 categories that I gave them for risk: criminal, you know, police, civil, suing, ethics and reputation, or no risk, the one that was used the most was the civil risk. Over and over again, young people were like, well, the victim would sue, or the victim could sue, more than for police intervention, even for criminal offences. And again, it's that idea of the individualised citizen not needing any support. And I mean, you don't have to look very hard to see where that rhetoric comes from, that idea that a good citizen doesn't need state support and doesn't need this kind of intervention. So I think for me, as a sociologist, that was really, really interesting.
I'm always perturbed, I think might be a good way of kind of describing what it is that I'm seeing at the moment. So this idea of the digital citizen, and I think, what? That's just my interpretation. What does that actually mean? What? So we don't expect children to be a citizen of the world and to manage everything, but yet when they go online, they're supposed to be a good digital citizen. And for me, I kind of go, what does that actually mean?
Well, teach them about basic human rights. So I'm not quite sure how that's meant to, and you know, and again, to me, that this is part of, dare I mention the NL word, neoliberal thinking. I know it's a bit of a, but the ideal neoliberal citizen is one that can manage by themselves. They're self-governing, self-managing, self-responsibilizing, and they do not need state support and intervention. And, you know, for me, humans are social creatures. We are group creatures. We all have points where we're vulnerable and we need help from other people. And I wonder, you know, if the concerns that we've been having around mental health problems amongst young people is part of this idea that's got into them that they have to manage everything by themselves.
Yes. That was that is my main gripe at the minute, is these young children are being So for me, there's something about they don't ask for help, Kath. Well, of course they don't, because you keep teaching them not to ask for help. And then we say, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you come? And then we've also got the narrative of, well, why did you do that? Why were you on that site? So now the child goes, okay, I can't even ask for help when I've done something wrong, because I'm not allowed to make mistakes. I'm not allowed to fail, and I'm going to get shamed for doing something. And lo and behold, that kind of feeds into probably why I was having the conversation with Jerry, the other podcast, about why people don't report things online, because they think they're going to be scolded, scorned, shamed, ridiculed, humiliated. And most of the time, that's our go-to reaction.
Yeah, and I'm very careful that when I teach social media law in schools, one of the case studies that I use around sharing indecent images is a real life story about a girl who an ex-partner had naked pictures of her, which he then tried to sell on Facebook. They're all under 18, and another boy wanted to buy them. And in that scenario, the two boys, the one selling and the one buying the images, were the ones who had police intervention, and they were charged with offences, but the girl did not. And I use that as an example because I worry that young people, when they are victims, will think, I'm just going to be told I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to be in trouble with the police because I took an image or I shared it, or you know, they're going to blame me, or they're going to say, how could you be so silly, you know. And that fear, I think in the worst cases, you know, is what drives young people away from getting help and into some terrible, terrible situations where they feel alone in the world and they have no way out. And so I really want to stress to young people, I'm teaching the law, but I'm also talking about, you know, victims and perpetrators. And, you know, it's not going to be in the public interest to send a young victim of revenge porn to prison. Like, it's just doesn't make any sense. So trying to kind of reassure young people, I guess, from that perspective, because, you know, it's not good enough for us to keep blaming victims. The idea that, you know, it's somehow inevitable that you are going to be a victim of revenge porn is really problematic to me, because we're not looking at whose behavior is actually creating the risk and the problem, you know, the perpetrator rather than the victim here.
We do a lot of fear mongering of children, don't we?
And you know, the world is a big scary place even for me. You know, I'm nearly 30, and I wake up sometimes and put the news on and think, oh, it's a scary old world out there, you know. So you don't want to do too much of that, I think, to young people as well. It's got to be sensible.
Well, I'm hoping to have a conversation with somebody who does a lot of conversations around victim blaming. It was her PhD, and we keep missing each other calendar-wise and so on, but I'm going to pin her down and do a podcast with her as well.
I look forward to listening to that. Unfortunately, it's still very rife, and I think the more we can challenge it, the better. I mean, that's one small thing that everybody do, actually, when we talk about online abuse and digitally enabled kind of offences. The one thing I would love everyone to just start doing is, if they hear somebody responsibilizing the victim or blaming the victim, oh, you shouldn't have posted this, or come off social media for it, just to counter it, just to challenge it and say, actually, are you victim blaming there? Maybe we should focus on perpetrators' behavior and not victims' behavior.
Absolutely. There's so much more I could talk to you about, Holly, but we've been going for nearly an hour, and this has become the generic platform now for not sticking to half an hour. So
good to hear.
So, is there anything you would like people to know about you? I'm going to put your so you've got your website that you run as well, which is about the online media and law. I think it's called Online Media Law, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I'd love to do. It's
as it is.
What it is. No, so that is I've been doing online media law training since 2013. And I've trained amongst the thousands of young people who've had my training through this police-funded project in Surrey. I'm increasingly doing training for university students. I said I train journalists. I've done training for lawyers in training, and businesses and teachers and people involved in safeguarding for young people. Training, resources. And also, just if you want to email me and have a chat, I'm very open to that as well. But that's Online Media Law is my Twitter handle, and you can find links to the website there and find out about what I do. So yeah, thanks for that. Let me have a
I will also put in, I've just written it down, why is the sky blue? I'll see if I can get hold of that and put that in the show notes as well, so that, again, it's something that other people can find out about and go and have a look at. But thank you very much for giving your time up, and thank you for a brilliant discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.